Good morning and welcome to a special episode of this 30-day adventure to great photos. Alright, today I want to dig into composition. Composition is literally one of the most important things in your photography. And like Ansel Adams said, you don't take photos, you make photos. That is exactly why composition is so important, because composition is the way you're gonna be organizing your scene. Remember, we talked about it a little bit. You have the scene, you have the subject inside, and the story takes place in that scene. Well, your composition is going to make or break your story and how your subject is being perceived. Because the way you will compose that scene will enhance your subject or actually really distract from it, and the viewer is gonna get confused as to what to look for. So our goal today is to review a few different guidelines of compositions and see how you can apply it in your own work. Now, I want to preface that by saying that when I'm out there and when I'm shooting, as you might have seen in the on-location shoots, first of all, I visualize the image. As I mentioned at the beginning, I visualize what I want to create, what I want to tell, what kind of story, and then I see it, or sometimes it's reversed, then I see it, and after that I start the capture part. And that's when I get to the capture part that I start to find the right composition. But oftentimes I actually focus on the story and my subject first versus the composition to be perfect. What I mean by that is that I'd rather shoot a little bit wider on the field and then get my composition perfect by cropping and trimming whatever is not necessary in my frame afterward. Remember, it's always about removing what doesn't add up to your shot. So if you're out there and if you're on the field and you're a little bit fiddling and you don't know exactly how to get the right composition, sometimes it's okay not to get it in camera. You can work on it afterwards. It's not a problem. Don't freak out if that happens to you. I literally took shots sometime and just grabbed the subject as fast as possible because something was happening. And then I was like, wow, the composition's totally off. It's totally crooked, but I think I can still get something back in post. So if you're ready, we're gonna be reviewing a bunch of photos together. I want to show you the different types of composition, that the different rules that you can follow to make it easier for anyone looking at your work to feel like it's natural and to feel that it's beautiful. The reason is, as I mentioned in the past, is that it's simply the way we are trained as humans in our Western world. There are certain types of compositions that are derivated from art that we tend to prefer versus others. All right, let's start with the most important of all, and one that is literally a rule of thumb, which is called the rule of third. We talked about it a little bit. I asked you to seek for that lost third in some cases. I want to show you another few examples of how it acts and how I implement it in my work. Remember, most important part is that oftentimes I will shoot a little wider in order to make sure that I get a great composition after. So here is an example. Right here we've got our subject on the bottom third, literally hitting that line with the head, and then we've got the light entering at the top right in the top right third. And if you look on the floor, that light is literally taking up 2/3 of the bottom space. I wanted to have some kind of ratio, which was 2/3, 1/3 here between darkness and light. Another great example, super simple, that one, a road, and everyone has roads. You have roads in your backyard, you can play with that. Maybe you don't have those cool mountains, except if you live in Utah. But here, I literally started jumping in the middle of the road. I made sure when I recropped that photo and when we shot it that I would be on the top third. I literally asked, because I asked Trina, my wife, to shoot that one. It was like, put the focus point on the top third. I'm gonna be jumping over here so you can see it. The top third is over there. And then we have the road leading behind me and disappearing in the background. So we've got 2/3 of the road foreground, 1/3 that is literally in the background and the sky. Easy to look at, easy to recognize. Remember, all of those composition rules are just rules that are made because people feel that they're more visually appealing to most. Now, there's something to say. Rules are meant to be broken. So if you feel like you don't like one, or you lean more towards one than another, that's totally fine. I do too. And personally, my rule of third is my go-to. Another example, 1/3 of the road and 2/3 with the clouds and the sky. Why did I take 2/3 of the clouds and the sky? Well, that might seem pretty obvious, but the cloud is massive, and that's kind of the story, you know. I have a human element in here that's easy for anyone to relate to, but we have that massive cloud that looks absolutely surreal. I did not edit that photo. That's how I shot it. It was just insane. I just couldn't believe it, to be honest. I just wish a car would come at the same time. It didn't happen because that could have been cool, or having a friend over there, that would have been even more epic, because having that human element, remember, makes it really, really relatable. Next shot, a little bit more complex, I will agree, but let's look at that. Let's put that grid. What do we see here? We have 1/3 with light and no bus stop. That's a bus stop, by the way, and that's the shadow of a man. So 1/3 purely in the middle with that bus stop and the guy leaning against it. And the guy is on that 1/3 line on the right, and that last part over here has no one. Now, you might be thinking, why didn't I just recrop like that? You know, a little bit tighter. Well, I could have, to be honest, but in that case, I wanted to have a little bit more information, simply because I kind of like knowing that it's a bus stop at the top. And if you press O, you'll see different rules we're going to be talking about, but you can also see how it crops for different formats. So you can see 2x3, which is the format for that image, 5x7 and 4x5. When I want to export it to Instagram, it is going to be 4x5, which means I already know that I will be removing the top of that bus stop. But me personally, in 2x3 format, I liked it with the bus stop. All right. Next photo is not a great example of rule of third, because I wanted, remember that train track in Chicago shot at night? Well, I wanted those train lines, the rays of light, to actually be leading towards that out point, which is in that 1/3 quadrant at the top. And actually we could crop it a tiny bit more, right, like that. The reason is I really love entering right here in that lower third and exiting in that top right third. And what it creates is a great leading lines, and I'll show you a few more examples after it. That shot, guys, I shot it a lot wider and recropped it in post. The reason is I wanted to integrate as much as possible into my frame. I wasn't exactly 100% sure how I wanted it, and because I was shooting wide, I didn't want to distort that area nor that one. So I shot a little bit wider, not to have those arrive really in the angles of the lens. Although you can compensate, sometimes it's not perfect. That kind of works out really easily and very nicely. Now, super simple, 1/3 of the ocean, 2/3 of the sky, nothing special here. That shot is a little bit more interesting. Look at that. All right, that's how I shot it. That's a great example where getting the shot is more important than getting my composition. I wanted my subject in that specific movement. I wanted my subject right there, and I didn't have time. It happens very often that you see something and you're like, wow, it's awesome, I need to shoot that, and bam, you try to click it, and then you're like, oh, my composition is not perfect. No worries, because you can get it in post. Right off the bat, what you can see in that image, so is that girl is going towards the right, that guy is going towards the left. I added some motion blur, and that's why I spent a lot of time on week 3 with the shutter speeds, because you might be thinking, I already know all that. Yes, but do you integrate it every time? Do you generally think about it and try to integrate it to add another element into your images? If that's the case, that's awesome. If that's not the case, think a little bit more about it sometimes, because you might be surprised you can do so much with just changing camera settings. Okay, so I'm cropping that one a lot more. I'm straightening a little bit my horizon, but not too much, because it's not that straight anyway. And here, what I want to do is, there we go. I want to bring those two humans in the middle third, and I want to leave room for them to enter and exit the image. You see what I mean? That girl entered that image and is gonna exit on the right third, and that guy is gonna exit on his left third. And that's super important for me. That's my artistic vision. I kind of knew about it when I shot it. I knew I had to leave room for that girl to be able to progress into that image. So that's a good example of how I do it on location, how I think about it, and then after I actually bring it back down to what I want. All right, and now let's move on to the next composition rule, which I really love, which is simply placing your subject, the most important thing, in the center. Now, what is the center of an image? It's simply the middle. Why would you do that? Because that's the easiest compositions to understand ever. Everyone gets it. What is the most important? Well, just look in the middle of that frame. On top of that, when you're on social media and they crop it into a square format, it's also very nice because then you know that your most important part is always in the middle. So, for example, that surfer guy was a longer shot that I had to recrop for social media, and I made sure that this guy is in the middle of my frame. I kind of like it. On top of that, we have a triangle happening right here with the waves, which I think gives a little bit of perspective. It also adds a little bit of leading lines and just creates some kind of shape at the top of my surfer. And the surfer's in the middle, everyone gets it. He's the most important part. All right, next shot, that sailing boat at sunset passing by. I got super lucky, the sailing boat was here. The way I composed that image was, as you can see, clearly with the bottom third on the horizon line. So I have 1/3 of the water, 2/3 of the sky, but also if you notice, well, my sun is kind of in the middle, and keeping that in the middle quadrant is actually very important because it makes it easier to look at. If it was in a corner, we can try it. Look at that. If it was in like a corner or so, it would look a little bit different. You know, it wouldn't be the same feeling. So depending on what you're trying to create, remember, middle can be great or different. Okay, next one, shot in Chicago during a night photography challenge. That shot is very interesting because that's not the original, that's how I cropped it. I have my guy in the middle, but the way I shot it was wider, and that's where it's so important. Look at that, on the right, we have that guy's hands coming in, and obviously it's totally distracting. You don't want it in your shots. On the left, there is a white part, it's not adding anything either. And on the top part, there is too much information. I shot a little bit wider, I was under the constraints, so I didn't know exactly if I would get it right, but I knew afterwards that I was gonna like fix it a little bit later. So that's what I did. I just went straighten it a little bit, went a little bit shorter, boom, got the guy here, and voila, that's my final results. That's how I cropped it afterwards. So don't overthink it. If you're not too confident when you're shooting, make sure you spend some time reviewing the images and really trying to keep only the most important elements. Fun fact, actually cropping came a lot from my wife because whenever I would ask her to help me with photos after, she would love cropping just to get back to the most important part in an image. And it always got me thinking, oh wow, maybe I should do more of the work in post. Keep it in my mind when I'm shooting out there, but don't overthink it too much. Now, depending on your camera, you can crop more or less, but generally I have a vision of everything and I know I don't need to crop massively. It does happen sometimes, but not always. Okay, what do we have next? We have leading lines. Leading lines is another way you can have great compositions simply by helping your viewer go through an image. You want to lead your viewer entering that image and exiting it while showing him what's the most important in an image. So right here we have an example. Actually, I'm going to show you two examples at once. We've got one with a car, one without a car, and both of those are roads, and I use them as leading lines. Now, there is something to realize is that one feels a lot deeper, one image feels a lot deeper than the other because leading lines actually take you on a path throughout the image, right? And the longer the path and the further it goes in that image, the more feeling of that you get. So if I look at the left one, that's cool. I think it's a pretty cool one. But if I look at the right one with the car, you can see it goes on for a lot longer. So you feel that the world is longer, that the landscape is deeper, and to me that works better. So whenever you can find leading lines to lead you somewhere, and here your eye is being led towards the horizon, That is awesome. You'll see the next example is very self-explanatory. That's the perfect example of leading lines. Look at that. The road is literally leading towards the horizon over there. Got a subject over here. So you cannot miss the subject because it's literally on the path for your eye. It's like the highway for your eyes towards the horizon. So you really get sucked into that image. Now, we talked about that shot a little bit earlier. And same thing, your eye comes here and exits here. And now another New York classic shot, but still beautiful and still had an amazing sunset. So that really adds a lot to that shot. And just parenthesis, if you ever go to a place and you find that your composition resembles or looks like someone else's, or that place is overshot, come at different times. For example, when it's raining, or just after rain, or just before. You will get changing conditions, and that will change the way your shot looks. I mean, if I had taken that one on a great day, maybe it would have looked like 1,000, but that sky is fairly unique, I would say, because it literally snowed and rained and everything 5 minutes before that. So I was very lucky with those conditions to be on that bridge at that time. Okay, back to the leading line. Right here on both sides, we have the road leading, boom, towards the inside of the image. You can see I'm a little bit under the top third, so you could crop it a little bit in, but then I would be losing of my sky. So you don't have to follow the rules by the rules. You don't have to be like fully like religious about them. You can bend them to your will. What else do we have? We have an example, not by me, but by Ansel Adams, of a great leading line made by that river going through the landscape and leading you to the background of those high mountains. Very, very classical examples for leading lines. Now let's talk about something a little bit different. Most of you have been using that rule of third, that grid, to compose your shots, but there are a few other grids you can be using. And if you're on Lightroom right now, just press R to open the crop tool and then press O and walk through those composition guides. Rule of third, diagonals, triangles, breaking that image into 1, 2, 3, 4 different triangles. And then we've got, that's the golden ratio, by the way, it's 1 to 1.618. And here is that spiral I want to talk about. Supposedly your eye follows that path. There are oftentimes in those images that you might want to use that guide just to find an exit point for your subject or a placement point for your subject. So for example, we could crop in a little bit here and bring our subject just at the end of that spiral. And this is what the shot would look like. It wouldn't be a bad idea at all. I think it looks pretty cool indeed. If you press Shift and O, you can now also change the direction of that spiral. It's really about what works for you and which rule, which composition like guideline do you prefer to use. Me, as I mentioned, I love the rule of third. But let's try another example with that spiral. And here's our landscape. And you can imagine that your eye comes in, looks at it, and poof, finishes over here where I want with that little path. Because if you looked at it, there's a road here. And so it's kind of like an exit point in that image. After you've seen everything, you can see the detail, you can see the road, and you can just exit over there. So that's how you could be using it. Another example would be to place your person, the portrait, in at the end of that spiral and have everything else in that image leads toward it. I actually kind of framed that guy with those are fruits in the bouquet, and then he was just talking to a client. I was just shooting through. I had an idea of what I wanted. That's why I framed him. I wanted to get rid of whatever was around. But on top of that, if you use that composition guideline, you can also make sure this guy is here and not somewhere else, because that might not work as well. That gives you a little bit more context. Now we have another one which we talked about already, which is symmetry. So guys, you know how symmetry works. Symmetry is fairly easy. You have one thing cutting the image in half. And I mentioned in one of the on-location shoot, I also believe in fake symmetry, meaning repeating patterns without them being exactly the same. Think trees, they're never gonna be exactly the same. But if you can have a frame where you have trees on the left, trees on the right, and something in the middle, why not? And it's the same with that road. The left side and the right side is not purely equal, but there is a sense of symmetry in that image. That's another example with the Oculus, and we have our subject right in the middle, like kind of splitting that image in half. The floor was supposed to split that image in half, but it didn't really happen, and that's where you might want to see, you might notice that you were not exactly aligned perfectly. So that's one of the thing I mentioned in one of the video on location in Guatemala. I was like, take those 5 extra seconds to make sure you're always dead center with your images. Even if you shoot wider, if you shoot tighter, doesn't matter. Just make sure you're dead center, because if you're off center, you will lose your shot. I mean, that's not too striking, and you might want to like Photoshop those lines out so you don't see it, but still, it's at the back of my head, you know. Other great example, drone shot. We have a pass between 2 islands. We're repeating the pattern here, but those are not exactly the same trees. The concept is the same, splitting patterns in half basically. And here, another little symmetry with me in the middle, door on the left, door on the right, and a lot of negative space, which is our next point. So what is negative space? First of all, simply means that you have a lot of non-distracting elements into your image. And when I mean non-distracting, it's so non-distracting that it could be just a blue wall or a white wall. It makes your compositions a lot simpler. That image has a ton of negative space. Look at that. Almost like 80% of that image is occupied by the same uniform background, which is red. And that is crucial because anything that is not that red background really stands out. So you have that door that really stands out, and you have that lady in blue that really stands out. And that negative space helps you just guide your eye and makes it easier to read that image. That image is very simple to understand. Next, we have another image of her in the middle of that street. You can notice that the cobblestones are not aligned with the door, meaning I was dead center with the door, but the cobblestones moved a little bit, but that's okay sometimes. Negative space here, obviously the sky has no information. It was purely cloudy day, and actually I want to focus on that little area where we have a ton of negative space under the arch, all the way down to the buildings, and that's where I wanted to place my subject. I wanted my subject to stand out. Remember when we talked about it? I wanted that subject to be on that negative space as much as possible because it would make it way easier to pop out of that screen. So use negative space whenever you can to really give a strong element to your subject. It really makes it pops out because everything else is the same. Last thing we can be talking about is simply triangles. Alright, so triangles. Why triangles? Simply because it gives a direction to your image, either upwards or downward. We have a triangle over here, and we have 2 over there on each side, and at the same time we can have a little one here that is wider. And what it does is that it just adds some kind of frame into your image. It makes it easier to read. It makes it a bit nicer to look at, in my opinion, again. Here, a little less obvious triangle game going on. So for me, in my head, I literally had a triangle between the sun hitting and the floor, and I wanted my subject to be somewhere over there, so that when you look at the image, you go from the sun down, you follow those lines, and then you follow that triangle line back left, and then you hit that little subject. That's a lot to think about at the beginning, and even after, if you have experience, you might not think about it all the time, but I highly recommend you to work on your photos afterwards and try to find compositions that are interesting. Even though you didn't think about it on location, try to work on that and see what else can you find. And another example we just talked about for symmetry, we also have triangles happening right here on the top quadrant. And we have a bunch of leading lines. If you guys didn't notice, look at that leading line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So each one of those creating also their own triangle. I think it's pretty cool. Last but not least, another image by Ansel Adams, where you can see clearly that this guy has had a bunch of triangle. Here with the sky, we have 1, we have another one with that mountain, and then we have another one with that mountain here. So it's very geometrical in a way. Although it has curves, it does feel very geometrical. And look at those leading lines taking you all the way behind the mountain. They start literally here, right on the right side of the image, and take you all the way behind the mountain. Pretty cool, right? That's Ansel Adams also. All right, guys, I hope that has been helpful. I know it was a very long video, but I wanted to dig into all those images because I want you to think about your shots like that, and not necessarily just when you're on location. I want you to think about it after, once you've shot those images. So make sure you always have your rule of third grid turned on, or another one if you prefer, and seek those compositions when you're out there. Take your time, especially if you're not shooting people in action. Try to take your time to always get it right. And if you want, go in single point focus, put it in one of those intersections in the rule of third, and then start shooting more and more like that. It will make a big difference in your work. I know it's a lot to remember, but yeah, maybe watch it another time if you need to. Really absorb all that information and try to find it in your own work. All right, good luck. See you in the next episode.